All right, good morning. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature Organization. And how many folks are here from out of town? Almost everyone. That's amazing. Great. Well, the Iowa Summer Writing Festival is definitely one of the jewels in the crown of the City of Literature, and so we thank Amy and her staff for making this happen every summer. And definitely, it's worth a round of applause. And the ability for our organization to partner with the Summer Writing Festival is a wonderful treat and has happened as we have taken on this MusicIC Festival, so we appreciate that. So MusicIC is a festival that is now in its 7th year, and it celebrates the connections and the intersections between chamber music and literature. So it should be right up your alley, we hope. And this is really kind of a sneak peek for you of some of the programming that you'll be able to see throughout the course of this week. We start with a free concert at Trinity Episcopal Church tonight at 7:30, which is just down the block here on College Street. We have another concert at Trinity at 7:30 tomorrow night. We move to the Eliot Theater, which is all the way around the corner, at 7:30 on Friday. That is a ticketed event, and you can buy tickets at the box office day of, or you can go online to eliot.org. And then we have a family concert on Saturday morning at 10:30 back in this room. So it should be easily navigable, even for those of you who are from out of town. The festival this year has the theme of Transcendence, and you can read all about the different pieces that will be performed in this program. There's some over here on the counter. If you didn't happen to grab one beforehand, feel free to grab one now or when you leave. Some great program notes about the pieces that will be performed throughout the course of the festival that were written by Tricia Park, who is both the festival's creative director and the principal violinist for the Solera Quartet, who you will hear from today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tricia, who will lead us through today's program. So thank you.
Is that working now? Okay. So, hi, I'm Tricia. This is the Solera Quartet, Miki on first violin, Molly on viola, and Andrew on cello. We're delighted to be here with you for this 11th Hour event. We're going to be focusing on the music of Beethoven this afternoon, technically. It's almost afternoon, right? We're morning. And Jennifer Fawcett, who will be joining us on Friday, was originally going to be here today, but she has a little wee baby at home, so we have some childcare issues, so we're gonna take it over without her, and we hope that you will look favorably upon us, regardless of Jen not being here. Don't worry, we're fun. So just a little bit, I'm gonna put my violin down because I don't have enough hands for all these things. Hold on. As John said, we're going to be starting a series of concerts starting tonight. We're going to focus on Friday night's concert, and we're going to be playing Beethoven's Opus 132 String Quartet and pairing it with poetry by T.S. Eliot. And so none of us here are Eliot experts. We're vaguely Beethoven experts, so we're going to focus on that. But that's all to say that actually to say that you're an expert in either of these monumental artists' work is kind of impossible. You could spend a lifetime spending, hours working on any one opus of either of these giants, and it would not be enough time. So we are humbly here to sort of share some of our experiences, both as performers but as musicians, in our kind of insights and into these works. And I'll also share with you how it is that I kind of selected the excerpts of Eliot and my experience as a kind of Eliot novice and coming into finding the connections between these two giants and their art. So just a sort of preview of this piece, Beethoven. You all know who Beethoven is, right? He's the guy who wrote this. Yeah, that guy. So we're actually visiting Beethoven at 2 points in his life during the course of the festival. We'll be meeting him as a young man, and we'll be playing an early quartet of his tonight at Trinity Church. But this piece, his Opus 132, is actually a piece from his late period, and most of you if you know Beethoven, will also know that his history encompasses the fact that he went deaf and started to go deaf very young, actually. He started to go deaf in his 20s, and it really plagued him, and it was a huge obstacle among many obstacles in his life that he had to face. When we meet him at Opus 132, he is completely deaf at this point. He's 54, it's 1825. And not only is he completely deaf, he has suffered from this, what we probably think is like irritable bowel syndrome now, but this incredibly debilitating gastrointestinal ailment, and he thought he was going to die. And it was upon his sort of rather miraculous recovery that he composed this piece, this 132. The heart of this piece is its third movement. The piece is in basically 5 movements, and the third is kind of central to it. And in an unusual moment for him, Beethoven was loath to put a lot of extra musical indication or instruction in his music. It was usually very just kind of abstracted. And in this piece, he actually writes that this heart movement, the third movement, he calls it a holy song of thanksgiving to the divinity by a convalescent. So this piece is really about gratitude and about him feeling so much joy and ecstasy at having a second chance. That said, he is very close to the end of his life. He only lives 2 more years past the composition of this piece. T.S. Eliot, I came to learn, was actually really inspired by this Opus 132. He's inspired by music of Beethoven generally. And what he says in a letter is, he says, while having the record of 132 on his gramophone, quote, "I find it quite inexhaustible to study. There is a sort of heavenly, or at least more than human gaiety about some of his later things, which one imagines might come to oneself as the fruit of reconciliation and relief after immense suffering. I should like to get something of that into verse before I die." And it was with 132 possibly in his ear that he wrote his epic composition, the 4 Quartets. I read the 4 Quartets as sort of preparation and trying to select excerpts for this, and what really struck me that was experientially similar to the late Beethoven quartet that we're going to be exploring with you today is that they're both incredibly dense works and at times really impenetrable. I think I'll say that upon our first listening of a string quartet from Beethoven's late period as students, it can sound really alienating, like just so strange and bizarre, and a lot of it is really incomprehensible. And I felt that way reading the 4 quartets of Eliot as well. But then every now and again, almost without warning, there would be these passages, these incredibly beautiful musical, lyrical passages that would bloom forth out of nowhere. And as a reader, that kind of being in the forest and then coming upon some sort of idyllic moment, or even if it was painful imagery, that's something that really struck me at my core as a reader. And I think that that's what happens with the Beethoven as well. So I think those 2 pieces, even experientially, are in dialogue with one another. So I think I've talked enough for right now, and we're going to play a little bit of the opening of the first movement. This piece, you can kind of think of it as maybe possibly, I've read articles where they think, oh, maybe this is a kind of a memoir or a kind of something autobiographical in this piece. The piece itself lasts about 40 minutes. We're not going to play all 40 minutes for you. We're going to play little bits of it, hoping that that will entice you to come on Friday. But they unfold as sort of chapters in a rather epic novel. And this first movement opens with this very, very tense interval, and it opens rather unusually that each of the voices come in on top of each other one at a time, and it creates this sense of incredible tension that's only finally released when the first violin, Miki, today just explodes in this flurry of very fast 16th notes. And did you want to say anything, Miki, about the opening? Yeah.
One thing that we've been finding fascinating throughout this process of learning the Beethoven quartets as a ensemble, there are 16 such quartets, is coming to say, like we spent a lot of this year working on 132, Opus 132, which is, one of the late quartets, as Tricia mentioned, that Beethoven wrote in his 50s. And we have since been going back to one of his earliest quartets, well, his 6th quartet that he wrote as a very young man. And it's fascinating to be playing something he wrote in his 20s and to hear the seeds of what we hear at the end of his life, and to hear, really quotations from the, foreshadowing where his mind would be going and the things that he'd still be chewing on in the twilight years of his life. And we had a little dark joke in the group that, if it's a good thing there wasn't better therapy at that point. Because we can see these same things are still plaguing him. And in the quartet, we're playing actually this early Beethoven quartet tonight at Trinity Church across the street, his Opus 18, number 6. And this is, again, while we're not giving you great evidence of that, we really do swear that Beethoven is not that explicit in his, in his biographical renderings in his music. But there's one other such moment in the quartets, and it's in the last movement of the piece we're playing tonight, where he writes Melancholia over a part that, and there's a lot of speculation among scholars that this was actually Beethoven's depiction of bipolar disorder. What now is thought of as bipolar disorder, but in that era would have just been considered a melancholy, in the depressive state. And what's interesting is that in the Melancholia that we're playing tonight, you hear the following. And you hear the quartet answer that in canon, in round. And that was something he wrote at the very beginning of his career. And then now we'll play for you how the Opus 132 begins. That feeling of what we would call a half step, so the two closest notes you can possibly play together, no, and then jumping to a higher or lower part, and then having the same interval, da, 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 is a motive that a trope that is throughout Beethoven's music and often depicting some kind of extreme tension and suffering.
And then the entire movement, this first chapter, if you will, of this piece, really is very unsettled and unsettling throughout. Even when it kind of releases, it never really does. There are moments of happier music, and even that has this kind of roiling rhythm underneath that never lets it feel calm. And then the movement culminates in this tremendous coda that we'll play for you in a moment that seems to depict this kind of, as Miki said, incredible internal struggle, this tension that never finds full release. then we move on to the second movement. The second chapter in this story, if you will, is a minuet, a kind of precursor to the waltz, a minuet in trio, and it's in ABA form. And it's a very typical form for composers of this time. It's a dance. But the things that are unusual about this movement is, first of all, it's a very long dance. It goes on for a while. And there's something, again, maybe slightly satirical in that choice that he makes. Beethoven, as a member of Viennese society, I think always he was a real iconoclast in general, partly for many reasons, but partly because of his deafness, also felt kind of misunderstood. He was famously saying when he felt that he had been mistreated by a prince. At the time, many musicians were, well, as they are now, but sort of many artists had patrons, and they were often of the noble class. And in one case, when he felt he had been mistreated by a prince, he said, "Princes, there are 1,000 princes, but Beethoven, there's only one." So he definitely was his own man. The things that make this feel different than the normal minuet or sort of a waltz dance movement is that, first of all, it's quite long. Also, he does something with rhythm where it never really, like a normal waltz is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and all the people in their big ball gowns and their powdered wigs know where to put their feet. And with Beethoven, though, he continually subverts that expectation. He moves the downbeat around a lot. He also has these very extreme dynamic changes, so really quick, fast to soft. So I kind of imagine in my eye that he's maybe slightly thumbing his nose at Viennese society and its inhabitants. I imagine in my mind's eye, like especially when we go back for the minuet again the last time, that they're all in their heavy gowns and their powdered wigs and they're sweating and they're like, when is it all going to be over? So there's something in that. And then, Miki, do you want to talk about the trio a little bit? Yeah.
One hallmark of Beethoven's life was that he had sort of a safe place he could go, which was called the town of Heiligenstadt, which sort of roughly translates to the holy city, right outside Vienna. And it was sort of a place where, and actually it's the place where he went to convalesce when he wrote this piece and wrote the central third movement that Tricia mentioned earlier. But he did see the countryside as a place of peace and a place of respite from all of the fuss that Tricia was just describing to you. And so, it's very typical in this form for the composer to interrupt the dance in the middle and to take us to a different place for a few minutes. And so where Beethoven chooses to take us is out into the countryside, and you hear sort of this alpine yodeling from Tricia and myself, and you hear kind of, we always wonder whether it's yodeling or bagpipes, but it has that kind of flavor, a little bit of the Ricola commercial from the 80s, like sewn in. It has a little bit of that feeling, but then again, you kind of get this feeling that maybe some of the noble class have shown up in the countryside for a picnic, and suddenly we get that awkward displacement coming back in, even in this respite contrasting section in the middle.
So first we'll play a little excerpt of we're in Viennese high society with our minuet. Now to the countryside.
Yes, Beethoven was bad to the bone. Yeah, but and for the record, yeah, I'm hoping that they got the whole thing on the recording. Otherwise, I just sound like a lunatic. Yeah. So the third movement is the one that Tricia mentioned as sort of the heart of the piece. And Beethoven wrote on his manuscript, speaking of this piece as a Heilige Dankgesang, or a holy song of thanksgiving, composed in the Lydian mode, which is basically a sacred music mode often, in thanks to the divine for the healing, upon healing by a convalescent. In general, what we know about Beethoven's domestic life in Vienna, that he was often moving from apartment to apartment. He didn't have a lot of stability. He had a very fraught family life from childhood, in fact. So his safe space, his haven, if you will, was this area, Heiligenstadt, which was quite remote at the time. And actually, I have to say, I studied in Vienna for 2 years, and I went to visit Heiligenstadt, which now is on the commuter line, so it has not quite the same mystique. But it actually, and I'm not just saying this because we're here, but it reminds me a lot of Iowa City, at least in the summertime when I've been here. There's a lot of rolling green hills. It feels very lush and verdant, and it just, you can breathe deeply. And so Beethoven went there quite often when he needed a break from himself and from society and from life. And one thing that is interesting to keep in mind about Beethoven was that he was very self-conscious about being a composer, and presumably he knew he was a great composer, and that was his whole identity within society. And to have that and to also be, for the most part, deaf was an incredibly socially isolating thing for him as well. He tried to hide it as much as possible, and he isolated himself even from close friends and family. Often we learned, actually, when he was a young man, he went out to Heiligenstadt and wrote this letter to his brother, which we found later, that's been known as the Heiligenstadt Testament now among scholars, where he talks about how all these sort of angry and curmudgeon-y quirks of his personality are largely a result of feeling isolated because of his deafness. So to dial back, so he's in Heiligenstadt trying to recover from this ailment, and he gets a moment of rest and a moment of strength again. And so he decides to write this piece of thanks to God for the healing. So the piece is in 5 parts, similarly to this whole quartet. And it's built like a club sandwich a little bit. So there are 3 slow sections, and in between those 3 slow sections there are 2 more upbeat fast sections. And the 3 slow sections all share similar material. And we as a quartet, in building our interpretation of this work, we've talked about there being 2 characters, 2 voices in the slow sections. So there's this human, reaching, striving voice. Can you play the very beginning? Mm-hmm. So you hear that the notes in that opening seem to reach upwards. Da, da, there's a lot of space between them. Da, dee. And also, even when they fall, dee, yeah. Mm-hmm. They almost sound like sighs or some kind of crying. They sound very like vulnerable and human, right? And that's one character that we hear in this slow material. And then there's another character that answers that material back and forth and is in dialogue with that material, which, if you're Beethoven in 1825 in Vienna, and well, he had a German background, so. What is your symbol, auditory symbol of the divine? It's a Lutheran hymn. And so we hear like Beethoven's creation of sort of his own imaginary Lutheran hymn tune. So hear how different that material is. There's not the big sweeping reaching and the falling. It sounds in a way more measured and holy. And all of the notes are very close to each other, and they move in this measured way. So in each of these slow sections, there's this dialogue between the reaching, striving, vulnerable human voice and this divine answer. But they really remain separate in the first iteration. Then as we move into the first fast section, the section 2, we suddenly hear an energizing to this sacred sounding music. And suddenly we hear something that's very human, but also very, very full of joy. And it's fascinating because this is right around the time when Beethoven was writing his 9th Symphony with the epic Ode to Joy finale with choir, and that's probably one of the most joyous pieces of music ever written. And we hear this incredible emotional outpouring from Beethoven. And what's really interesting is, so if you're an athlete and you've been benched forever and you have a good day, what do you want to do? You want to run a marathon. You want to stretch your muscles. You want to just feel capable and just revel in your own strength with the humility that it has been taken away. And that's exactly what we hear Beethoven do. We hear him as a composer throwing every possible flourish and lace doily onto this music in an incredibly brilliant way. Do you want to play just a little bit of that? Yeah, and so we hear this joyous dance full of flourish and full of ornamentation. Then at the end of that section, we go back to another slow section, this conversation between the human voice and the divine voice. And this is where we'll begin our excerpt that we'll play for you. But instead of now every voice playing the hymn tune together and every voice having the human voice, suddenly just the first violin has that hymn tune. And so it becomes more focused and in a way more angelic, answering these reaching human voices that are getting more and more intertwined. Then at the end of that section, Beethoven again feels this sense of extreme joy and gratitude for being alive. And I have to say, there's a lot of joyous music in our canon, but Beethoven has this way of writing joy into music that I think he captures it better than any other composer, because there's like an extreme humility built in, but at the same time, this incredible virility and like seizing of the day, this quality of seizing the day. And so we hear again, and he actually writes above the music in this place, Neue Kraft, or new strength. This is the place in the music where I feel new strength and I'm able to seize life. And after that section, we go one more time into this conversation between the human and the divine. And in the second section, when all the human voices were intertwining, we were getting a little bit closer, getting more developed, the dialogue was getting more intertwined, more complex. And in this third section, we hear suddenly the two materials starting to overlap for the first time. And what's very interesting is that just as the music begins to gain this kind of undeniable momentum towards union between the human and the divine, it takes what we think a bit of a left turn. And it goes to a very cold, dark place, which is always surprising to us when we play this piece, even though we've played it so many times now. And from there, Beethoven digs even deeper and goes to an even more vulnerable place. And the entire process begins one more time. And it almost has this sense that he is then looking up this mountain, and instead of having to climb the mountain reaches down to him. You have this incredible sense, and the two materials completely overlap and become one in this sort of big bang cataclysmic moment. So we're going to be sharing this piece with you now. So we're going to we'll have a little abridged sandwich. So we'll have a slow section, a fast section, and then end with this cataclysm that I just described. So thank you.
Thank you. It's always such a privilege to be able to make art and make a living at all. And so we feel really lucky. And it's when we have moments like this that we get to come into contact with art that sort of gives us maybe a channel to something other than ourselves. It's incredibly rewarding for us. And I know all of you as artists too, in your own right, have that experience of being a kind of vessel. And so that's really amazing for us. Another part of what we do as a group is we spend a lot of time playing for lots of different audiences, and some of them are people who are in hospice or in hospitals or nursing homes, and also we go into correctional facilities. And I'm going to let Molly talk about that in a second, but I also just wanted to share a personal anecdote about this piece and how healing art and music can be. I learned just yesterday actually, an email I got out of the blue from an old friend who I hadn't talked to in a long time, who's recovering from a really serious illness, and apparently she and I haven't talked for a long time. She's been listening to this movement of 132 as part of her recovery. And when I shared that with my colleagues here, we learned that we have another, Miki and Molly have a friend who's also, and a colleague who's also come to this piece with that in mind. So there's something very special about this piece. We hope you experienced a little bit about it. And I'm gonna let Molly talk about our prison project a little bit.
So we, over the past year, have been we've been the resident quartet for Project Music Heals Us, which is a nonprofit which takes concerts into a little bit unusual settings, and we've been going into prisons quite a lot over the past year. And our experience, we specifically wanted to take this piece into prisons because well, as you can hear, it does transcend. And I know the first time that I heard this piece, as Trisha mentioned, I was definitely one of those. I just felt so uneducated, and just I might even have fallen asleep. I really didn't know what to listen for. And so going in and having the opportunity to one, get to know this piece myself and not fall asleep anymore in it, and then also get to introduce such an incredible work of art to those who I'm pretty sure would never have had the chance to hear that, has been just, it's proof that this piece really does transcend. Our experience in doing that has been very, very humbling, in that the reactions of the people that we usually tend to think of as uneducated and the scum of the earth type, their reactions have been more visceral. They didn't fall asleep on their first hearing. Their reactions were like tears and like 3-page long thank you letters explaining their experience and what they heard in the piece, and that like Beethoven was the man, and like it's just been, yeah. So sorry, I'm kind of blathering, but I wanted to say, actually, Trisha has this quote. I'm not sure where it is in your. She sent out. Sorry, one second. This quote that there's no separation between self and other, and everything is interconnected. Once you are aware of that, you are no longer caught in the idea that you are a separate entity. And just playing this piece in those settings, it shows that we really are all connected, and this piece can do it. So that's all I have to say. Sorry, that was...
So after all of that deep profundity, what does one do next if you have to continue this story on? Well, like, the Juliet's nurse or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet, Beethoven takes a sharp turn and gives us, of all things, a funny little march next. That leads directly into this moment of recit, again, taking a cue from opera. And we provide underneath Miki's kind of passionate wailing. Again, this kind of moment where she's kind of having this outpouring of grief and fury, and then we go straight into the last movement, which again is a kind of a waltz. It's in 3, and we're going to play some excerpts of that for you, and then I guess we'll be done. Thank you. So yes, we'll be playing tonight and tomorrow at Trinity Church, just across the street. I know you all are busy during your time here. Those are both free events, 7:30. We're playing on Friday at the Englert, and you'll hear this piece in its entirety. And on Saturday, if you happen to be around, we'll be back here to do a family concert for kids, and families. I just want to leave you with a little bit of a quote from Eliot, just to have that sort of his inspiration by Beethoven come out to the fore as well. And this is from Little Gidding, from the Four Quartets. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning, every poem an epitaph. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So with that, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. We hope we see you at something that we'll be playing at. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you to John, and thank you to Amy.